Hello, everyone, and welcome to the book launch of the sixth volume in the NORRAG series on international education and development, The Rise of Knowledge Brokers in Global Education Governance. And I am the Executive Director of NORRAG, and I'm absolutely thrilled to present this book to you today. And this event is in partnership with, as you'll see on the screen there, not only NORRAG, the Global Education Centre and Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training, also with the Gottesman Libraries at Teachers College, Columbia University, the GPE KICS EMAP Hub, and also the UNESCO Chair in Comparative Education Policy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. So you're welcome. I'm Maura Fall, Executive Director of NORRAG. So this is the agenda that we will be following with you today. A quick welcome from me, followed by presentation by the editors of our newest book that we are very proud of, Chanung Beck and also Gita Steiner-Kamsi. And then we'll break into two panels where we will have the first panel on institutional logics and efforts in knowledge brokerage, followed by a panel on local contexts and inequalities in knowledge brokerage. And then we're very pleased to have closing remarks from Annabelle Litoz-Monet, who's a professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute and is on NORRAG's consultative committee as well. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know NORRAG all that well, we undertake 4 different types of strategic activities that you'll see in the center of that circle there. We make sure that we are always surfacing underrepresented knowledge and answering underrepresented questions as well. And as we do that, we are also brokering policy dialogue, co-producing knowledge, and sharing capacity and learning from others too. And as we undertake those strategic activities, we work with the hope and make sure that we are aiming to support our stakeholders get to their outcomes, which are to act on that knowledge, to amplify the underrepresented knowledge, and also to access that knowledge and fundamentally to know that that exists and what it is and how it is useful. We work in these 5 strategic themes, and as you can see from the color, the event today fits into our data and evidence theme, particularly as with all of NORRAG's work thinking about inclusion of marginalized groups. And then, in addition to those strategic themes, as we said, our strategic activities and stakeholder outcomes, we use those strategic activities within each of these themes. Thank you, Camille. And that last theme we looked at also includes the NORRAG network, where we're up to 5,800 members now, 50% of whom are based in the Global South. You are very welcome to join that network. You have a QR code there that you can click on your screen, and it'll take you directly to the sign-up page. We would very much welcome any new members today. And also, as I said, working from that principle of surfacing and amplifying knowledge, underrepresented knowledge and expertise, we have this initiative, The South Also Knows, which is also working towards that theme of knowledge equity. And here you have a QR code. If you are an expert from the South, then please click on that QR code and join the South Also Knows network. If you are not from the Global South, you can always look up the initiative, The South Also Knows, and find underrepresented experts in the publicly available database that we have made available for you. And without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to presentation from the editors of this fantastic contribution to knowledge on evidence and how it works in global education governance. Chanung Beck, who's an assistant professor here at the Geneva Graduate Institute, as well as being academic director of NORRAG and the UNESCO co-chair, and also Gita Steiner-Kamsi, who's the William Head Kilpatrick Professor of Comparative Education at Teachers College and UNESCO Chair in Comparative Education Policy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I will leave you now in their capable hands. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Moira, for your wonderful introduction. I also extend my gratitude to NORRAG, the GP Kicks EMAP Hub, the Gottsman Libraries at Teachers College, Columbia University, and the UNESCO Chair Program in Comparative Education Policy for organizing and sponsoring this event. And hello, everyone, all the participants. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of The Rise of Knowledge Brokers in Global Education Governance. Together with Gita, my co-editor, we embarked on this journey to explore and highlight the critical role of knowledge brokers in global education governance. The insights shared in this book were born out of engaging presentations at CIES 2023. We received enthusiastic feedback from participants and audience, which made us inspired to create an edited volume that combines academic and practical insights and serves as a knowledge broker itself on this very topic. Next slide, please. Our book critically reflects on and examines the growing importance of knowledge brokers in bridging the gap between research evidence and policymaking, a gap that has long challenged the global education landscape. A UNESCO-commissioned strategic review on improving evidence use in education policy, planning, and implementation that Gita, Moira, Anna, Kazaki, and myself conducted highlights two critical disconnects. The first one is the divide between researchers and policymakers, and the second one is global disparities in evidence production. Researchers and policymakers often operate in silos with different priorities, timeframes, and communication styles. And also, evidence from the Global South is often overlooked or underrepresented in shaping global education policies. And evidence from the Global North does not necessarily address the national priorities and needs, which limits the use of evidence in education policy. Adding to these challenges is the phenomenon of information pollution described by Chris Lubinsky, Joe Mallon, and Emma Rowe in this volume. They highlight how the sheer volume of available evidence today can be very overwhelming, leading to difficulties in discerning actionable insights. Knowledge brokers, therefore, play a very important role in brokering and contextualizing information to make it meaningful for decision-making. The rise of knowledge brokers also reflects a broader shift in governance. Education policymaking has transitioned from a centralized model dominated by governments to a decentralized approach that involves a diverse array of actors. This shift has opened up space for new players such as NGOs, think tanks, government-sponsored research organizations, and international organizations such as the OECD, the World Bank, and the IDRC to shape the discourse on education governance. Next, please. What is particularly fascinating is how knowledge brokers themselves have evolved. Now, knowledge brokers includes a diverse range of actors, as I said before. Traditionally, universities were the primary producers of knowledge, but they have since embraced knowledge brokerage as a means to create societal impact. In recent years, non-state actors such as think tanks, NGOs, and government-sponsored institutions have gained prominence as well. They focus on what works studies and aims to disseminate evidence to shape policy and practice. global organizations like the OECD, the World Bank, and the IDRC also play a very crucial role in this landscape. They also influence education governance through the production, distribution of research evidence. Next, please. It may not be surprising that more actors are now taking on the role of knowledge brokers. But what exactly is knowledge brokering? The role of knowledge brokers goes beyond simply translating research into policy recommendations. It is a dynamic and interactive process that involves first facilitating relationships and removing barriers to collaboration, and spanning boundaries to introduce and adapt new knowledge across contexts, and co-creating evidence through collaboration and shared expertise. Like a linear transfer of knowledge, knowledge brokering emphasizes interaction and adaptation within and across systems, and it also ensures that evidence remains both relevant and actionable from and for diverse stakeholders. Next, please. Previous research, such as the study by Ward, has identified 4 critical questions that frame the understanding of knowledge brokering. First one is why, the functions and intended outcomes of knowledge brokering activities. The second dimension is whose, the sources and producers of the knowledge being brokered. Third one is what, the types and content of evidence being mobilized. And the fourth one is how, which addresses the mechanisms and strategies used to implement and disseminate knowledge effectively. Building on these 4 dimensions, the contributions included in this volume explore the evolving role of knowledge brokers in education governance, the diversity of actors, including international organizations and non-state actors, the importance of national context and priorities, and finally, the overarching theme includes the systematic inequalities and power dynamics that shape evidence use and knowledge brokering practices. With that, Geeta will now provide an overview of the contributions included in this edited volume in greater detail.
Thank you so much, Chanung. If you can just pull up the next slide, which is basically the table of contents. The book itself tries to, like NORRAG, bring always the 2 different sides that usually don't talk with each other or don't communicate or don't interact. And in this book, we have the 2 groups. One of the one group is the ones that analyze and examine and critically reflect and advance research on knowledge brokerage on the topic itself. And then on the other hand, we have knowledge brokers themselves that present their own strategies, their own reflections, and their own trajectories over time, how they have evolved. So what we have here, what you see here, without reading it for you, because it's an open access book, you can get that book anytime. You have here in the chapters 3, 4, and 6, those that are on the knowledge brokerage side, foundations, but also international organizations. In particular, we have OECD, Michael Ward and Melissa Mouton, that talk about the OECD strategies and in the education sector on knowledge brokerage and peer exchange. And then we have Jacobs Foundation based in Zurich that talk about their evidence lab and learning labs that they have in the education sector. And we have IDRC that has a long-standing record in funding and accompanying and strengthening the use of research and evidence for policy planning and practice. IDRC stands for International Development Research Center. And they're based in Ottawa, Canada. And then we have really noted wonderful scholars that have analyzed the phenomenon and examine it in different ways with using different methodologies, quantitative, social network analysis, qualitative. And here we have the group in number 5, in chapter 5, with Moira Fall at the Geneva Graduate Institute, Anna Numa-Hopkins at in Warwick University, and Bart Sebastian Gabriel also at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And in chapter 7 and 8, we also have on the analytical side. 7 is an interesting chapter because it is composed of a composition of colleagues at universities, Julia Levin, but also in the KICS initiative, José Luis Canellas, and in the NGO, in the counterpart based in Kyrgyzstan, who is Janil Bokombayeva. And finally, we have maybe the most noted scholar who has written about knowledge brokerage for the longest time, and has also inspired actually the panel that we had at CIS 2023. This is Christopher Lubinsky. He's at Indiana University in the US, and he co-authored the chapter with Joel Malin at Miami University and Emma Rowe at Deakin University in Australia. So, and then at the very end, we have Maren Alford, who herself bridges 2 worlds. She has worked for many, many years with UNESCO. And as you know, she has co-authored the piece with Christian Ederson on the history of UNESCO, OECD, and the World Bank and their entanglements. And she wrote commentary for the book. So this is in a nutshell what this book represents. And all the other chapters are by Chanung and myself, framing the whole topic and the contributions. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. The next slide, please. And with that wonderful overview, if you are interested in exploring the chapters in more detail, please use this QR code to access the playlist of chapter summary videos. These videos provide a snapshot of key insights and discussions featured in each chapter. You can also find the playlist on NORRAG's YouTube channel for easy access. I will pause for 2 seconds for you to be able to scan the QR code. Next slide, please. I would also like to draw your attention to the actual book itself. It is available as open access, making it freely accessible to everyone online. You can use this QR code to download the full text of the book. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to the panel discussions. Thank you, Gita, the floor is yours. Gita, you're on mute.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you the panelists for the first panel. We have the representatives from the 3 chapters that represent the organizations that either fund or do knowledge brokerage. And first we have in the picture, we have Melissa Mouton. She works at the OECD as an analyst. And in the Q&A session, there are also the co-authors who you don't see on this slide and on the panel, but you will hear them, or you will hear their responses in the actual Q&A session and in the chat. We have there Michael Ward, who is the senior policy analyst in the Education and Skills Directorate of the OECD. Then we have Samuel Kembu. He is assumed just now, I think you got promoted to the Global Lead Learning and Evidence section of the Jacobs Foundation based in Zurich. And Samuel is joined in the in the comment section by the co-author, who is Donika Dimovska, also at the Jacobs Foundation. And finally, we have our very own Trisha Wind, who is representing IDRC, and she is leading this huge program funded by Global Partnership for Education. It's called KICS, Knowledge and Information Exchange, and this is also our connection with IDRC because NORRAG is organizes one of the hubs. And José Luis Canellas is the director of that hub. So we are very happy to have Trisha, and also in the comment section or in the Q&R section, we have Margarita Lopez, who is the analyst specifically for the program specialist specifically also for the KICS EMAP region that we are serving. So my job is to moderate the session, and it's a great pleasure to do so. And we have 3 questions, but hopefully we have some kind of discussion that is interactive and lively. And the 2 questions that we will discuss, 2 of them are more informative, and the third one is a little bit provocative to have everyone thinking and getting engaged. The first one really deals with the question of the how question. How does your organization, and what in your chapter, how did you present how your organization engages in knowledge brokerage? What is your approach? What are your strategies? If you, maybe all of you can just do a round and briefly talk about it, and then I will move on with the second one. Who wants to start? In my picture, I can see Samuel first, but maybe it's different. Samuel, you want to kick off this question?
Happy to go. Thank you, Gita, and thank you everyone for listening. So Jacobs Foundation is not directly implementing evidence labs or ed labs, but actually supporting other partners to do that. And what we have provided in the review is our reflections doing that over years now, and building on a more global and broader review that we did to inform a convening that we had on the topic at the time. So I would invite other participants interested to also look those complementary resources as going hand in hand with the book chapter. So to take the question under approach and strategy, I'll probably speak about the work that partners do, but also what we do as a foundation. So the approach that we seem to see, first of all, maybe taking a step back and talking about ed labs or evidence lab, which is the topic of the book chapter. We are categorizing them as multi-partner coalitions that will bring together in a given country the Ministry of Education, all subnational authorities, research institutions, practitioners to promote the use of evidence in policy and practice. It originates basically from the work that you two have authored at NORRAG on knowledge brokerage more broadly. A lot of the cleaning the space has been done at the time by the IDIC, and it's linked to the global literature on originating in political science. And in that literature in particular, when people talk about the approach, it's mostly the approach that they use to go to policymakers. And what we are documenting in the chapter is that you would have basically a continuum of models. One model which is, say, more embedded, where you would have those coalitions embedded in the Ministry of Education. And that's what we have in countries like Cote d'Ivoire and in countries like Ghana, at least for the ones supported by the foundation. And on the other side of the spectrum, you would have non-embedded models or independent models that would operate more like think tanks. In the chapter, we provide the example of eBase. It's based in Cameroon as a model that uses an approach of a non-embedded approach. And in between, you have all sort of models. And the strategies, I think, overall, those are very classical functions that relates to, building capacity, generating new evidence, synthesizing existing evidence, mobilizing evidence, and those are the strategies that they use. So this is a little bit of the work that partners do. Now, what we do as a foundation is actually facilitating that type of work with the funding, of course, but with some technical support. And I just want to provide one example and give the floor back, which is we designed, when we started this work, an evidence framework to facilitate the understanding of evidence, because everyone was talking about facilitating evidence use in policy, but obviously we were not in agreement on what we mean by evidence. So we had to start there and clarify that vision for evidence, at least for us and for others. And this is a contribution and in terms of approach and strategy that the foundation used on top of providing the funding. So I will stop there and give the floor to others. Thank you.
Tricia, do you want to go next?
Sure. And a warm hellos to everybody online, to my fellow panelists, but also those who have joined. I've seen a few names popping up on the screen as you've joined, and it's great to see colleagues I know and then a lot of people that I have not yet met. So my name is Trisha Wind. I'm with, as Geeta was saying, with the International Development Research Center. And the chapter that my co-author Margarita Lopez and I provided for this volume reflects on what IDRC has learned about knowledge brokering across a number of different themes, particularly in climate change, but also in studies that we've commissioned on how knowledge translation works in the Global South, issues, challenges, and then how those are applied within the Global Partnership Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, which is this initiative that GPE originated, and IDRC has the privilege of co-funding, but also managing its implementation with a broad variety of partners. As Samuel was saying, this work is done through a lot of different organizations, and NORRAG is stellar among them. So the chapter talks about how we've been incorporating knowledge mobilization in GPE KICS, the Global Partnership for Education, Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, through two parts, because KICS started because partner countries of the GPE were asking for a more structured mechanism from which they could just learn directly from one another about challenges and opportunities to strengthen their education systems, and have more ready access to tailored evidence and innovation for their contexts. So the chapter describes how the knowledge brokering then is built into the two main parts of KICS, which is 4 regional hubs that facilitate direct peer exchange and learning and consideration of existing evidence by people who are working in today's education systems. And the second part is through a portfolio of applied research projects that are on the topics that are identified as top priorities through those regional hubs. So I'll talk a little bit about how it works, and then I'll try to answer this question about how do these strategies aim to build trust, which is the key part of this question about how knowledge brokering works. So the regional hubs, I'll start with them. They support inter-country learning, often at the level of directors or technical experts in education ministries. The original participants in those regional hubs were nominated through the GPE focal point and through the Ministry of Education and through the local education group. And they are kind of the standing committee of KICS within the different countries. But then, of course, they bring in additional experts as you go deeper into different themes. The hubs support this direct peer exchange. So for instance, just so that you get a sense of what this is, so many countries are working to implement competency-based curriculum. There's a lot of interconnected parts that need to be aligned and often are not aligned as countries are taking steps to move into competency-based curriculum. You need to make sure that it's not just the tailored curriculum to the context, but also the teacher training and support, the learning assessment, changes to data systems. A lot of pieces have to come together. And a lot of countries would really like to learn from those who are embarking on similar experiences. So Kenya and Sierra Leone, people from their ministries of education were able to lead a community of practice where other African countries were able to learn from them who are a little bit further ahead in this implementation. And when, for instance, Uganda identified competency-based curriculum as a central priority in their partnership compact just recently, the hub was able to broker an even deeper connection beyond this community of practice where people from Uganda were able to not only go to Kenya, but have a series of exchanges with Kenyan experts on how do you move from A to B in implementing competency-based curriculum. The other experience that I'd highlight just briefly is the issue of data systems, where a lot of countries are trying to move from a somewhat static, once a year data collection on administrative issues to a education management information system that integrates learning outcomes, that is more real time, that is more demand driven for use in policy and programming, and use not just at a national level, but also at a district or even down to a school level. So there's a whole series of issues around data systems that a lot of countries are trying to move deeper. And there's been an ongoing community of practice through one of our regional hubs in Africa, where the data systems experts have, I would say, really become a community of mutual learning and support and critique in being able to move their data systems and look at what some of the exemplars are. The Gambia has really quite a sophisticated system And they are often sharing their expertise very directly with their colleagues. The other part that regional hubs do is they facilitate the consideration of existing evidence, whether those are global public goods that are developed through a variety of different international or multilateral organizations, or data coding and platforms that different countries can use for different systems. But what we've seen is that while these global public goods exist, there needs to be this connection, this knowledge brokerage, to actually make them land and useful in different country contexts. And so the hubs have been able to facilitate direct connections with those that have been developing those tools, but also national experts who've been using them and appropriating different aspects of them, and then leading learning sessions and learning cycles that help ground the use of those tools in the different national contexts. So in this, I would say, how do you build trust? I think the number one thing is that you need to be responsive to demand. This is not a knowledge broker just that needs to be supply driven. It needs to be demand driven for this to be trusted and availed of. We certainly see that this is about human relationships, not just institutional relationships, and people need to get to know each other before there can be a deeper sharing. So that community of experts in data systems didn't just happen. It happened because there has been an ongoing collective sharing and going deeper and deeper in seeing each other online, but also sometimes visiting in person and then seeing each other in international conferences. And then the other part that I think is helpful is that when you're getting national experts to share their experience, that expertise is often not codified in written documents and actually helping write what practitioners know and their experience into analytical documents and case studies gives them a lot more solidity from which to share their experience in the intercountry learning. So that's a couple of different ways, I think, in which the hubs have been able to support the development of relationships of trust and reciprocity. And I'm just really focusing on the Southern expertise and helping share Southern expertise across. I think in other questions, I'll answer more about the applied research portfolio, but hand it back to Geeta for now.
I want to make sure we have also time for the Q&A session. So Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geeta. And hello to everyone joining us today. So my name is Melissa Maltan. I'm an analyst at the OECD, where I've been working for a few years now. And I work on a project called Strengthening the Impact of Education Research, where we work with countries to understand their needs in terms of how we can support them in ensuring that their education systems are evidence-informed. So I co-authored the chapter in the edited book with my colleague, Michael Ward. And I think essentially, both implicitly and explicitly, we do look at strategies to build trust as knowledge brokers. So I would say firstly that one of the things that the OECD does that happens quite naturally, but is also an explicit strategy, is investing in relationship building. So what Tricia was saying resonates with what we do. So we build and we maintain relationships with policymakers, with stakeholders over the long term. And that is something that that really helps us build trust with these communities. We are also, as a long-standing knowledge broker, international knowledge broker in the education field, we have a certain credibility. And so a lot of what we do is about maintaining our credibility in as a respected organization. We have high standards in terms of the research and the analysis that we produce. We have our own internal peer review processes for the research that we produce. And this is also something that the stakeholders that we engage with, the policymakers, the countries that we engage with, they come to trust us on that matter as well, and that we have a certain level of credibility, and we really seek to ensure that we maintain ethical standards in our research as well. So as a member state organization, we're also accountable to our member states, and in particular, the research center that I work in, so the Center for Educational Research and Innovation, we are accountable to our governing board, and we meet with our governing board twice a year. And this is an opportunity also for countries to get an update on what we're doing, but also crucially to give us feedback on our projects. So that becomes an area of mutual influence as well. And in the chapter, we also go into some of the peer learning approaches that we pioneered here at the Directorate for Education and Skills. And really, an underlying ethos is listening to countries and working with them to understand their needs. So we really try and co-produce some of the peer learning events and seminars that we run with countries. And so our chapter in the book describes one of these seminars called learning seminars, and it's a type of peer learning that we use at the OECD, where the topic is very much co-designed with one host country, one host organization. And we really work in close collaboration with this country to develop the seminar, the program, based on a need that's identified in through these discussions. And we then use our network to invite other relevant peer country delegations who then come and present their practices on the given topic. But an important thing then to note is that our ambition, our aim is not to instruct countries what to do. We're really just trying to generate learning opportunities. But we're also using our international network, our knowledge of what other countries have put in place in terms of promising initiatives. And that's also what countries would come to us for. So this is perhaps the added value that a large international knowledge broker that such as the OECD, that we would bring to our approach, that we do bring an international network and a comparative element that decision makers are very interested in. So I'll just also note that one thing that we also aim to do is we aim to be very transparent in terms of the strength of the evidence base, in terms of the practices that we present from other countries, from research projects. We really try and clarify the strength of the evidence base regarding how effective those practices are. And perhaps how context specific as well. So we would highlight, for instance, whether the practice was evaluated, where it has been implemented, and where the gaps in the evidence base for effectiveness still are. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Geeta.
Thank you so much. So let me open. Actually, we are already very late, and you have like 10 minutes left for the Q&A on the first panel. So let me weave in also the other questions. And also, we have a very interesting question from Alev Mine. And let me just get back to you with 3 questions, and anyone can answer them. One is the one from Alev Mine that says, it is almost like a closed system. Once the knowledge is produced and it's brokered, it has a dynamic of its own. Where does feedback come in? How can you correct wrong knowledge or manipulative knowledge or useless knowledge once it has been produced and it has been brokered? What mechanism do you have in place for quality assurance, but also for diversity of opinions, for critical thinking, etc.? That's, if I understood correct, that was Alev Mine's direction that they are suggesting. The second is my own, listening to all the 3 interesting presentations. Is the government always at the end of the road? Who is the target audience at the very end? And I just know that, OECD doc, there's all this talk about enabling civil society organization for strengthening collaboration, international cooperation, humanitarian assistance. There are important actors also, CSOs, but maybe even universities might be important beneficiaries or end users of this kind of knowledge that could be funded. The third question deals with peer learning, and this is I think all 3 organizations are strengthening peer learning. Would it be accurate to say that this is another word for South-South collaboration that we had already in the 80s and 90s, or is this something new? So let's just start with those 3 questions that we have so far. Anyone can please jump in. And it's short. We only have like 8 minutes left, I think. Trish, I see you nodding.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about how to weave some of this together. Governments, I think, are absolutely central, absolutely, in the leadership in education systems, but we know that a variety of organizations are involved in its implementation. And I'm thinking particularly of things like early childhood education, where implementation models are government organized, but often spread across. And so the targeting of the knowledge brokerage and the involvement of different actors needs to always, I think, just understand the landscape of what is the issue and the subdomain that we're working on, and understanding the roles of different actors. And even while we say government, I think we've seen in especially the applied research projects that always start with a stakeholder mapping and a system mapping to understand that if what you're trying to do, for instance, is to scale the impact of something that's already working, but in a broader system, they need to understand all the different aspects of government. So we say government like it's one thing, but in fact, there's lots of different aspects to it. And I think of this one project that we were able to support on learning assessments for 21st century skills in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, led by an organization in Kenya, so very well acquainted with the system, still needed to do a thoughtful stakeholder mapping of who are all the different agencies that are involved in learning assessment and the use of learning assessment. How would that actually roll out? And it was very different in the 3 different countries. And then the ability to actually move some of the research that they were supporting into use was very dependent on the moments in time in those different country contexts as to whether they were able to capture these new ideas on 21st century skill assessment, how you would move it into their policy priorities and their implementation. And therefore, the results are different in the different countries. Zanzibar was very keen, and we've been able to move ahead on the implementation of some of that work in collaboration with people in ministries in Zanzibar in a very different way than in other parts of those 3 countries. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Melissa and Samuel, you want to comment on the 3 questions we had so far?
I'm happy to go with the first one, if that's okay. A live question. I think it's a very important one. And actually, when we think about how you would define these mechanisms that we talk about in the chapter, EdLabs, Evidence Lab, those coalitions, we think about 4 core ingredients. And one of them is that skill set and that ability to really play that role that is being described in the question. The ability to question themselves, the type of evidence that they are relying on to make any recommendations, decision-making, to facilitate evidence uptake. And there are other dimensions as well that we describe a little bit further in the chapter. But I want to emphasize one thing I said in my first intervention around what was the approach or the contribution of the foundation into setting up these evidence labs into the different contexts. And I mentioned that we started with an evidence framework, which was really ensuring that we have a shared understanding of what we mean with evidence. And this is important here because one of the core, or I would say the starting point of thinking about that, is to emphasize the culture of evidence within the organization, within the broker itself, whether the broker ends up being part of the government or not. And that culture could be manifested by seeing a strong commitment for evidence. And this is where you reduce some of those risks that are being elevated in the question. The ability to generate evidence and the ability to use evidence as a knowledge broker itself. So we signaled all those dimensions to partners as being important to really reduce that risk, because I think the question is absolutely critical. And it was therefore important a priori, before even getting into the full knowledge brokers and full speed, to make sure that we have that shared understanding from the get-go of the importance of having a culture of evidence, having a skill set that is needed to be a knowledge broker in the sector of education, and what that would look like, which was actually the hardest part. Thank you.
Melissa, but also Michael Ward. I see Michael Ward from the OECD is also in the room, but not spotlighted. So please go ahead, Melissa or Michael.
Thank you, Geeta. And I'll answer the second question as well. So who is our target audience at the end? Who is our core audience? So I think in the case of the OECD and in our directorate, it's very much governments. It is often governments. And even though we do work on evidence-informed policy and practice. So we in theory, we also work in terms of understanding how we can support schools and teachers and school leaders in making their practices more evidence-informed. It's often governments that we primarily target. And I think also in terms of our research has shown that that linear approaches are still very much in use in knowledge mobilization. Relational approaches are gaining traction, but that we still very much miss systems approaches. And I think quite often it's in governments that these kind of approaches are could be adopted. They might be natural actors where these kind of approaches could be adopted. We could have, for instance, more coordination of knowledge mobilization. There are certain ways that knowledge mobilization needs to be professionalized, and I think quite often it is maybe governments who are best suited to do that, to implement incentives in the systems for different actors for knowledge mobilization to be improved. And I'll invite Michael to add anything to that if he would like to.
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thanks for joining.
I'm sorry I'm late, but thank you very much for facilitating this. I could maybe pick up on this question about peer learning, whether this is South-South cooperation that used to happen, I think, from the 80s and 90s. I was there in the 80s and the 90s, and my experience of South-South cooperation in education was very much a donor-led exercise with institutions in the North very much driving even the South-South elements. I mean, I'm sure there are good examples that people can point to, but I think what we've tried to describe in our chapter about what the OECD practice is with peer learning, I think that's very different to those previous South-South models. In the example we've shared in our chapter, the countries are choosing who they want to learn from. And they're choosing from, a very large group of countries, almost 100 countries that are participating in the OECD's data collections. And then the basis of their learning is indeed facilitated by the OECD, but the direction of learning is very much driven by the country's interests. So what are their policy concerns, and which countries do they feel they can learn from? And I think our role in the OECD, as Melissa has pointed out, is very much a sort of a facilitator. So we can hear from a country what their concerns are, and then from our evidence base and our data sets, we can identify, oh, well, look, this country has had that challenge. This country has had that challenge. This is how they've done it. And then we connect countries. And we're a committee-based organization, so we're constantly bringing countries together around a table to discuss these concerns. So I think it's a very different model to those sort of, I would suggest, donor-led South-South cooperation models that came up in the 80s and 90s. And also there's more evidence. There's so much more evidence and information to inform these corporations now than perhaps we had before. Thanks.
So I found that very interesting in the OECD chapter, the Michael and Melissa's chapter on the reference societies that countries choose. Which countries do they want to learn from? That's in itself a very interesting research area. There's one question that keeps coming up, and it was actually in our own list. Is there like a specific agenda that you are pursuing as funders or as knowledge producers? Or also asked differently, is there a hierarchy of evidence that exists in your organizations that you're advocating for? Like what counts as evidence or as knowledge or trustworthy or relevant knowledge in your organization that might be different compared to other organizations? I don't know how much time we have, not much, but maybe 3 minutes. Anyone wants to?
If I can just, I'd be happy just to jump in, and that's a huge question. But maybe what I can say is that I think from our perspective, a hierarchy of evidence doesn't really make sense, because you need to start with what your questions are, and what is the context in which the knowledge generation is happening, if we're talking about a research initiative. So there can be no gold standard of an RCT if kind of program effectiveness is not your question. If your question is, for instance, scaling the impact of something that's already working, maybe you need to do some evaluative research in there, but you probably need a whole lot of contextualization research or understanding scaling opportunities and different delivery models. And so we start with, you need to start with a question, the context, and I would add, especially because we have a research into use focus, you need to understand what do the users of the research need to know. And if they need to know, for instance, costing issues, because they really need to figure out, is this implementable, or they need to understand system fit issues, then that needs to drive the research. And I guess the other part is that we really would valorize and highly elevate grounded knowledge in the context in which we're operating. So do a lot of funding of Southern research organizations that are embedded in those contexts. And, if I put a link again to knowledge brokering, it's because those organizations are going to be there if and when the project finishes. It's not like the researchers are going to leave. They are still there, and their organizations are there and have ongoing connections with the systems and the decision makers that they are influencing.
Unfortunately, I have to pass the floor to panel 2. I got feedback myself that I'm getting over time. We didn't answer the question on feedback quite, but maybe it comes up in the second panel also, or towards the very end. So thank you very much. And I'm going to give the floor now to Chanung, that is moderating panel 2. Thanks again, all of you.
Thank you, everyone, for staying engaged as we move to panel 2 of today's event. Before we move on to panel 2, I just want to remind everyone, to remind the panelists that there are many interesting questions shared in the Q&A box. So feel free to reply to those questions as comments, even though you were not able to answer verbally on live, but feel free to share your comments for those questions. So this panel 2, we explore questions on the nuances of reaching diverse audiences and addressing systematic inequities in the production and use of knowledge. We are very fortunate to have 3 panelists for this panel, each bringing unique expertise and perspectives to the discussion. Each of them has co-authored a chapter in the book we are launching today. The first panelist is Daniel Bokonvayeva, competence-based training coordinator at the Project Implementation Unit at the Ministry of Education and Science of Kyrgyz Republic. Daniel is also a member of the KICS EMAP Hub Steering Committee for Kyrgyzstan and has extensive experience in education reform and policy implementation. The second panelist is Moira Fo, Executive Director of NORRAG. Moira's research focuses on complex systems, decolonization, power dynamics, and the spaces between fields, offering a thought-provoking perspectives on knowledge brokerage in education governance. The third panelist is Chris Lubinsky, Professor of Education Policy and Director of the Center for Evaluation and Education Policy at Indiana University. Chris's research examines education policy, reform, and the political economy of education, with a particular focus on equity, access, and evidence use in policymaking. Now that we have introduced our panelists, let us begin the discussion by addressing the first question. Knowledge brokers operate in diverse local contexts, as the panelists in panel 1 also have shared, and they also work with diverse audiences. And this raises a very important consideration. Is there a nuance or a real difference in how different audiences are reached? In other words, does the audience or user matter for knowledge brokers? How is knowledge brokerage adapted to local context? If possible, I invite the panelists to draw on your chapters when answering questions. And also, please keep your answers under 2 minutes per question. I'll actually time you if you don't mind. Daniel, let's start with you, and then let's go to Chris and Moira. Daniel, let's start with you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm humbled to be part of this exciting event, and I would like to extend my gratitude to my wonderful colleagues and co-authors, José Luis Canellas and Julia Levin, who was the mastermind behind this article. Now, the short answer would be yes, but as I still have 2 minutes, the research that we have done highlights that effective knowledge brokers, they really tailor their tools, whatever they use, workshops, briefs, or articles, to specific audiences. In the countries that we have focused on, we have seen that it is important to put personal engagement first over passive methods. We have seen that successful brokering requires audience-specific adaptation and capacity-building initiatives. Because policymakers in economically underdeveloped countries are extremely overflown with information, this information pollution notion that Yu Chang Wang mentioned in the beginning, and they need really actionable insights addressing really specific challenges, sometimes very concrete challenges rather than raw academic data due to time constraints. In our research, we are focused on specific local demands of Moldova and Kyrgyzstan. In Moldova, there is a strong focus on aligning with European frameworks and leveraging open government data to inform policy. While in Kyrgyzstan, the context is shaped by challenges such as urban-rural disparities, multilingual education, and school infrastructure. And that exactly can be addressed more effectively through regional exchanges with countries which are culturally and historically similar, such as Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, for instance. So overall, our results show that understanding the audience's cultural, institutional, and professional contexts is key to effective knowledge dissemination. Now, our specific findings when we reflected upon cases of Kyrgyzstan and Moldova are several pathways to refine the KICS Hub's contributions according to specific audiences. First of all, offer capacity-building initiatives and bridge research and practice gaps for practitioners and for local stakeholders, especially mid-tier positions, which constitute the bulk of the audience that we address. We also found out that supporting the transfer and integration of knowledge across sectors within the education system is extremely important. We also found out that concentrating on specific thematic priorities that align closely with national education priorities is a must. And we also found out that putting personal engagement first, as opposed to a flood of official written communication, is the key. This is the most effective method of knowledge sharing, and it was central to our approach as well. Now, lastly, in our study, participants indicated that there is a disparity between the knowledge that is globally provided and what is nationally needed. While international donor organizations produce a lot of wonderful research and they offer a consolidated global viewpoint, they often overlook the unique needs and demands of individual countries, varied as they are. For instance, Kyrgyzstan is interested in practices and approaches with culturally and geographically closer nations like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which is also a very mountainous country like Kyrgyzstan. So the issues and the problems and the challenges are similar. And that could serve as a guide for innovation scaling. For instance, also, teacher preparation and attrition, educational standards and competency-based educations. These are all very common themes and very common points among our countries. In Moldova, the tendency is to focus, of course, on integrating into European frameworks. Also, as we know, Moldova is also facing the challenge of integrating refugee students from Ukraine. So at the same time, also trying to restructure teacher preparation and development. So in a nutshell, global research is extremely valuable and is needed and is asked for, but it also needs a lot of efforts from our sides to translate it into actionable policies and to support local research as well. That's
Thank you, Janil. Thank you. Chris?
Hi. I'm going to echo a lot of what Janelle said, and the short answer is yes. I worked with Joe Moline and MRO on this project, and we're also finding that relationships are of the utmost importance in a lot of the brokerage that we see, and that takes on different manifestations, whether it's personal connections or reputations or institutional affiliations. And those are often articulated in different ways, whether through direct contact, through institutional endorsement, an individualized report or op-ed in mass media, for example. And those do tend to vary quite a bit based on the intended audience or the local context, is what we're seeing. So we in our chapter distinction about traditional public policymaking, that is seeing government policymakers as a target, but also privatized policymaking. We're seeing increased activity, for example, from philanthropies, which are in essence making policy as well. And so those become also a potential audience for brokers. So the second part of the question is knowledge brokerage adapted to the local context? Absolutely. We focused on the U.S. voucher debates in our chapter, and we're seeing sometimes a willful provincialism, if I could say that, where policymakers are intentionally uninterested in what's happened, say, in Sweden or in Chile around this issue. But not just that, but also when presented with national data about what works or what doesn't work, they're not particularly interested if it doesn't specifically apply to their own state. That is, they see their local context as preeminent and kind of canceling out any other larger trends in the data. So that effective brokers recognize that, and they intentionally, I think, refine their message for those local policymakers in local contexts.
Thank you, Chris. Moira.
Yes, definitely agreeing with everything that has been said before. Fundamentally, brokerage can only work if the broker understands and can communicate effectively with their audiences, plural, and their users, plural. And if we think of it from a sort of an academic point of view, a network conceptualization says, the broker is situated in between different communities, two or more. But actually, just taking a structural perspective means that we can totally overlook just how important it is, as Chris and Janil both said, how it is that these brokers act, what they do. So it's really thinking about this as relational and action and not just structure. And so what are the actions, as Trish said, to build trust? And building trust is also contextually appropriate. So there are some cultures where you need to sign a contract before you can trust the other party. There are other cultures in which if you do not trust the other party, you will not sign the contract. And if you don't know that kind of cultural sensitivity, context specific, you can't do the job. And then also, sort of really being careful about thinking about how power operates. And the broker needs to be very, very sensitive about that. And all of us who are working in the space need to be sensitive to it. Because if we think, sort of about the power in terms of, sort of the power of the what works narrative, that actually overlooks the importance of this context sensitive and demand driven work. So, context sensitivity, many would find it absurd to uncritically apply evidence from my country, Zimbabwe, into a high-income country, and yet sometimes we're expected to uncritically apply evidence from high-income countries or tools that have been developed on the basis of data from high-income countries. And, sort of really making sure that this is responding to the needs here and the needs now. And then demand-driven, obviously, as also mentioned by many people. And then sort of moving from this linear sort of A plus B equals C, evidence plus policy equals good, to the relational approach, and then moving into systems also, which was mentioned earlier. How does the broader system incentivize working with useful, appropriate evidence or penalize not working with it? And how do systems leaders support that or not? And here we really see IDRC as exceptionally good practice of systems leadership with context-specific, demand-driven, useful evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Moira, and thank you all of you for your thoughtful insights on how audience and context actually matter, and then they shape the work of knowledge brokers. And this leads us to our next important question, which delves further into issues of inclusion and representation. So the next question is, whose knowledge is being brokered, and how do knowledge brokers ensure the inclusion of marginalized voices and knowledge production in their practices? And before I give the floor back to the panelists, I would like to remind all of you in the audience that please kindly share all the questions in the Q&A box so that we can ask those questions to our panelists a bit later. Thank you. Let's start with Janiel again, and then let's take the same order, if you don't mind. Janiel, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. The first part of the question was where knowledge comes from. We believe that the knowledge comes from various sources with wonderful credibility, such as global research, national statistics, and national and local and regional case studies, of course. However, the use and recognition of knowledge is skewed towards global research. Local research is less utilized, especially in my country, in Kyrgyzstan, where I do admit national studies are often viewed by policymakers with skepticism and lack visibility. Sometimes I even think this is a vicious tendency of self-sabotage, where we don't give enough trust and credibility to our own experts and to our own expertise. In Moldova, similarly, local knowledge production is also hindered by underfunded academic institutions that are forced, due to various reasons, to put teaching first and research last. At the same time, we have another common concern, which is the quality and accessibility of nationally produced data. One of our respondents said that a lot of policymakers still consider knowledge and information as some kind of a state secret that has to be carefully kept and protected. So hence the need to enhance empirical research skills, the need for information campaigns, the need really for building trust, as we have discussed before. And these factors, they really could lead to marginalization of crucial audiences, topics, and concerns. We have not seen a very salient marginalization so far in our countries, but the factors that I have just mentioned could lead to marginalization. So in our study, we did not explicitly examine how knowledge brokers engage with marginalized voices. However, our respondents highlighted several relevant aspects. For instance, first, there is little focus on incorporating knowledge from underrepresented or grassroots communities, which is a special venue a researcher has to undertake. There is, of course, an issue of low compensation for researchers, limited resources for national studies. For instance, recently I was just present at an annual report session of the National Academy of Sciences, where renowned scientists with decades of experience were mentioning lack and absence of funds for field trips. And this is really a big concern for the national science and education. And another point is the dominance of English language, English literature, English research, and consequently English paradigm will exclude non-English speaking scholars and communities. And in Kyrgyzstan, there are not that many scholars and communities that speak English at the academic level and read academic articles and are able. There are notable institutions, universities, and think tanks and individual experts who speak excellent English, but the disbalance is very silent here. So, and in both countries, both in Kyrgyzstan and Moldova, the common concern also is the quality and accessibility of nationally produced research. Sometimes the lack of experts, because one of our respondents that finding a national expert is like finding a needle in a haystack, and there's always some agenda attached to it as well, affiliation-wise and so on. So there is maybe a strong need to enhance empirical research skills in our countries. And that's what KICS Hub aims to do. It aims to empower national researchers by providing platforms and methods and venues for capacity building and knowledge production, fellowship and learning cycles. And also, what is worth mentioning here is the multilingual dissemination that we also witness right now at this event, translation into several languages. And there's a lot of effort going into this, which we all appreciate, by the way. And we also need to emphasize regional collaborations for Moldova, for Kyrgyzstan, for our countries and regions, in order to really fix things. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaniel. Chris?
Thanks. Yeah, and I wanted to pick up on something Maura mentioned, which I think is really important about how trust is paramount. Which is true, but we're also seeing in our work fewer sanctions for not using reputable sources, which I think is different than previous times where sources that provided unreliable or false information would lose standing, because I think we're moving towards more of a mercenary model of brokerage in some cases. Effective intermediaries often sell themselves not on their ability to produce or translate research, but on their connections and how they're able to get access to policymakers. But to the question at hand, we'd like to think that research, evidence comes from reputable sources, and that's what gets brokered. But we know that's not the case. I mean, certainly in the current administration in the U.S., there's not only been a agenda to sow distrust of traditional sources of information, but also put pressure on those sources of information to not necessarily provide reliable information. That is the traditional firewall that allowed agencies to provide trustable research is being challenged. I think there's always been questions about what is research, or what is evidence in that regard, and not only that, but who's an expert, who is reputable in a particular area. And what I think is interesting here, I mean, I know the question is really validly focused on the question of underrepresented voices in the global South, for example. But in the U.S., we're also seeing a move towards more representation of underrepresented ideological views, ones which are often not research-based. But the claim is that they're excluded from these conversations, even though they don't really have good research evidence to support their views. But nonetheless, there's an official move to center those voices more. And also, I want to point out, with reference to the question of what is research, knowledge can be many different things, and that includes anecdotal knowledge can be seen as a form of evidence in policymaking. So we often see examples of those types of personal stories, often from underrepresented communities, those stories being brokered. But one thing we see in our research is that sometimes means that those individuals or those communities whose stories are being featured, they lose control of their own narrative as it becomes a product within the brokering marketplace. So I think that's an important thing to keep as well, as not just whose voices, but do they still have control of their message?
Thank you. Moira?
Thank you. So I ended my last intervention with the mention of sort of how power operates and, sort of really sort of the power of how certain more linear technical accounts of evidence and policy really tend to overlook the operation of power and marginalization in the research and evidence that is allowed to be used and taken seriously in policy making. And so in our chapter, particularly with the chapter that we contributed here, was me with Anna Numa Hopkins and also Bart Sebastian Gabriel. And in our chapter, one of the things that we do is we use bibliometric analysis to compare research in public health and education regarding evidence use. And in terms of who is cited, there are different network structures, if you like, between public health and education research. But exactly the same in terms of the overproduction of global north in compared to global south, high income countries versus low and middle income countries. Also, in terms of who collaborates, there were collaborations between high income researchers with low income or middle income countries, but there were no lower or middle income countries in the top 10 in terms of collaborations, both in public health and also in education. Which language, as Janil said, around 1,800 publications in our sample in both public health and education in English. The next highest language, in public health, there were 5 in comparison to 1,800. 70 in education, so we're a bit better in education than in public health, but that's still less than 4% of the English language production. So this really matters. So, and then, sort of this tending to treat evidence as a technical universal process, which is rational and it's context-free. There is some way of having a completely objective way of thinking about what counts as strong or weak evidence. This, sort of going back to that hierarchy of evidence, which is actually being challenged even in evidence-based medicine, and we discuss that further in the chapter. But if researchers fail to cite research from the very geographies and the very epistemologies that are affected by their work, then how is it that we can say that this is useful? That paradigm of technical rationality has become very widely accepted. And that means that that is an operation of power. And we do need to recognize this as a key narrative in the work that we do, at the same time as we are moving in a parallel direction, talking more about context, context relevance, and utility. The overpowering conclusion that we came to in our chapter is that evidence and policy are technical processes. Of course they are. And they are also run through with politics and power. And we ignore that second part of the equation at our peril.
Thank you, Moira, and thank you so much for all your insights. I see there are several questions shared in the chat box, but given the limitations of the time, I am trying to pick up a common theme that were discussed among the answers and also appeared in the questions, which is about the existing structures and existing perceptions. When knowledge brokers try to be a bit more influential, there is always this question about to what extent they need to align their approach to existing structures and existing principles and existing perceptions of credibility of knowledge sources and so on. But then a lot of times these existing structures and principles may not be the suitable, welcoming environment for the marginalized voices and perspectives that we just described now. So how knowledge brokers then manage this balance? They might have a dilemma in terms of they want to be more influential and impactful, but then the question is influential in which ways and so on, right? So I'm sorry that the question may not be super clear, but if you can share a few thoughts on this point, 1 minute per person, that would be really helpful. So let's start with Moira at this time, and then take the reverse order.
I'm going to try to answer what I understood as the question, but I'm afraid the multiple interpretation broke in as you were asking the question. So forgive me if I've misunderstood. So the influence there, I think, is there's something that we need to look at what's in our field at the moment as what is influential. What is influential is the importance of evidence in policy. Then what is influential is this linear, rational, technocratic modernity, enlightenment ideal of what works in one place works everywhere. And it's just purely about whether it's been published in, sort of this journal or that journal. So what then the question is how is it that we are working within that to move the needle in terms of what it is that we feel should be more influential, and recognizing that the other agenda is also an ideological agenda. Saying that something is rational and technical and has no ideology is an ideological statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I'm also not sure I heard the whole thing because of the interference there, but as I'm trained to do, I'll answer the question I wish was asked rather than what was necessarily asked. I think that sometimes we see, especially in education, a lot of lip service to the idea of research evidence guiding policy. And it's become fashionable among a lot of policymakers to talk about that and the importance of research evidence. And even in some cases, mandating that or creating these hierarchies of different types of evidence. However, when you look at their actual actions, I think that it really exposes that a lot of that is just kind of rhetoric at this point. I can point to many examples where the hierarchies they set up of different types of research evidence are tossed aside when it's inconvenient. Then it goes against their own ideological positions, which goes to what Mara was saying about filtering through politics. And some work that I've done with Joe Moline, for example, we see policymakers explicitly throwing out their own goals that they had implemented for particular policies and moving the goalposts, as we say, to create new goals when the old ones didn't really necessarily come to fruition. So I get a bit skeptical about this idea of research evidence in policymaking.
Thank you, Chris. Danielle?
Yeah, thank you. Knowledge brokerage, as has been said before, is a political act, and it's shaped politically, and it has political aims sometimes. So our task is to be as impartial as possible, to be as open and transparent as possible, and to consider ourselves as honest brokers, and to try to benefit all sides, both academics and practitioners, marginalized communities and communities which are not that marginalized. So the really crucial role here is to find the balance, to not create more imbalance and more injustices and more barriers than are already here. So I don't know if I could answer the question right. That's what I also thought from.
I'm sorry for not being clear about my question, but I think I'm impressed how all three of you still managed to answer in a very and share your beautiful insights. So once again, thank you so much for your discussions and comments. And I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time to bring in the co-authors of the chapter. I know that from the audience that we have Bart in the room and also Joe. I apologize for not being able to bring you into the discussion, but due to the limitation of time, we have to end the panel discussion now. But I'd like to thank all of you for very engaging discussions and insightful comments. So to bring this very event to a close, it is my honor to introduce our final speaker, Professor Annabelle Litos-Monet. Professor Litos-Monet is a professor of international relations and political science at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Her research interests include global governance, the politics of knowledge, the role of international organizations, bureaucratic expansion, and ethical expertise. Annabelle, the floor is yours for the closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Shen Wong and everyone else for the invitation today. It is really a pleasure for me to provide the closing remarks of the event. So first of all, big congratulations for this very exciting and very important edited volume. I have learned immensely from reading some of its chapters before the event. I found it to be a great achievement in the way it explores, discusses, but also problematizes the actors and the practices of knowledge brokering. So Of course, as you have mentioned, I have worked myself on the politics of expertise, not in the field of education, which I actually do not know much about, but rather in the field of global health and also bioethics. So perhaps some of my comments will also be informed by the observations I have made in my own work. So I'll just talk about some takeaways which I found to be particularly significant in the volume. First of all, I really appreciated the discussion on how knowledge brokering as a practice is not only a neutral exercise. I really appreciated all the discussion about all the decisions that need to be taken as knowledge needs to be brokered. So, of course, knowledge brokering involves selecting the evidence which needs to be included and the evidence which cannot be included. It involves also a range of functions, including assembling, packaging, translating, and promoting evidence. So this is very well pointed out in this volume. And of course, what that means is that some decisions need to be made as evidence is selected, processed, translated. And here you discussed very nicely that without knowledge brokers being agenda driven, nevertheless, those decisions need to be taken. Here, some of you have discussed the possibility of having certain hierarchies of evidence that, of course, impact the way knowledge brokering is practiced. I think this was contested. Some of the speakers saw these hierarchies of evidence as being there and stable. Others felt like they are rather contested and actually do not play that much of a role. For example, Moira mentioned that even in the field of global health, those hierarchies are being challenged. I think this is an excellent point, and I have observed that in my own work. Yet, I would say that very often when such hierarchies are being challenged, it is from within the dominant paradigm. Right. So where, of course, as many of you might know, like certain forms of evidence, when research has been produced through an RCT and so on, are considered as more valid and also, as a result, more useful than other forms of evidence. So while, of course, there is a critical discourse on that, the fundamentals of the paradigm are not fully challenged. So I wonder in the field of education how that plays out. And I think I really appreciate the discussion that has been taking place on the role of evidentiary cultures. Even if there are no clear hierarchies, there are cultures of evidence, evidentiary cultures within which we all work, which favor certain definitions of what is seen as evidence, of what is seen as useful evidence, and on how to assess evidence as well. I also wonder if demand shapes such understandings, as many of you have pointed out during the panels. Is there then some room to present alternative knowledges if the response must be adjusted to the demand, and if a common kind of language needs to be there for this understanding to take place between those who broker the knowledge and those who are the audience? These are open questions, and of course I realize these are the closing remarks, so I will unfortunately not hear your responses, which I'm sure would be very illuminating. Another takeaway, which I found particularly interesting in this book, is the way knowledge brokering is also taking place in an increasingly commodified knowledge market. This definitely resonates with what I have observed in other areas of global governance, where we indeed observe a general commodification of expertise, where knowledge becomes a good like any other. And that has to do first with the increasing privatization of knowledge production, where we observe private data centers, companies, of course, which produce data, including big data, policy labs, and so on. And of course, I realize this very much complicates the role of knowledge brokers. How can such data, evidence, and knowledge be evaluated? Second, we observe commodification of the knowledge market also, as we see that we observe the spreading out of an industry of knowledge processing and knowledge packaging, which has become central as we live in circumstances where we have a kind of evidence overload, where we have too much evidence. So evidence needs to be processed, selected in order to be seen and in order to be heard. And I observe that also in other fields where, of course, we have designers, communicators, also marketers, which do not produce knowledge, but which play an important role in making it accessible, in communicating it, in making it attractive and visible to an audience. So here it is not knowledge itself that becomes a good for sale, but the packaging of knowledge that is also becoming a competitive exercise. Of course, then in relation to knowledge brokering comes the question of who can afford resorting to knowledge brokers? Who can afford knowledge brokers? And which seem increasingly necessary in order to give visibility to certain forms of evidence in global governance. So here the question would be, is the necessity for knowledge brokering in this environment of evidence overload producing perhaps new inequalities between those organizations who can afford knowledge brokers, who have the competence to select evidence and assess it and make it presentable, and those who cannot? These are like open-ended questions, of course. Finally, I would like to go back to the question of trust, which you have all very much discussed in relation to the role and practices of knowledge brokers. I found those debates to be extremely interesting, of course, especially in the current context where of course, we have policymakers, politicians everywhere in the globe who invoke sometimes very dubious forms of evidence in order to further their agendas. So this question of trust, of course, is highly relevant. At the same time, and I think that we all know the relationship between power knowledge, right? The nexus between power knowledge. And knowing this, it is very difficult, I would say, in order to boost trust in some form of evidence, to make claims of authority and to resort to a claim of scientificity in order to gain trust in this specific context. So here, and again, this is just food for thought, but I would argue, isn't the role of knowledge brokers today to include as diverse forms of evidence as possible and to present controversies, debates, and all the options available rather than present a specific perspective, which seems to perhaps be more defendable on various grounds? Is it perhaps not better to actually try to include as many perspectives as possible when knowledge is being brokered, and then the function of the knowledge broker would be seen as that of enlarging the realm of available perspectives and knowledges rather than suggesting a specific perspective? And I would argue that perhaps in the current context, that might be a great way of gaining greater trust. And I will end there my comments and congratulate everyone again for wonderful contributions, from which I have learned immensely. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, for that extremely nutritious food for thought on those that you've given us there. And I would like to say, so Chanung and I are also the managing editors of the whole NORRAG book series, which Gita was the founding editor of. And so we're extremely proud to offer the latest product here in this book series. You'll find the link in the chat. We are also, just to let you know, we're very interested in your feedback in what it is that we do in our work to improve the next event. You will receive an evaluation form. You will also receive an email with the recordings that you can share and the link to the publication again. And do please join the NORRAG network. We would love to see you at more of our events and in our work. And we have 2 upcoming events. The first one is hybrid. So if you're online, you can continue being online. If you're in Geneva, we'd love to see you at the Maison de la Paix. And that is our UNESCO Chair Series in Comparative Education Policy. And one of our colleagues, Felicitas Acosta, is coming from Buenos Aires to speak with us on that day. And then in March, we have an event on transforming development in education. So it's really looking at not just about talking about education on its own, but also how it is embedded in broader development contexts and contests. And last slide, I think, Camille. Yes, just to say thank you all very much, all of the participants today, the entire NORRAG and KICS team that has been supporting us with all of the technical work that is required to go into making such an event successful. And thank you also to the Gottesman Library at Teachers College, and to all of the contributors to the book and to this event. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one.